All right. My name is Dr. Amanda Grev. I work for University of Maryland Extension as the forage specialist. So thank you all for joining us today for this month's Women in Ag webinar. As you can see, today we're going to be talking about strategies to extend the grazing season. And with that, we will get right into it. So just kind of, an overview of reasons why we might want to be thinking about extending the grazing season or potential benefits involved with extending the grazing season. First, to reduce the need for stored forage. Usually stored forage is a little bit more expensive than grazing. So the more we can kind of extend our grazing season and focus on different things that can allow us to graze for longer, usually the better off we are in terms of economics. Also, labor is one part of that. So, it does take a lot of work to take feed out to animals, deliver feed to animals, move stored feed around. So, as much as we can kind of let our livestock do the work for us by harvesting that forage themselves, sometimes we can reduce our labor, both time and expenses associated with labor. And then hopefully this will allow us to be a little bit more profitable in the long run. Like I said, grazing is usually a little bit more economical when we pencil things out compared to stored forages. So these are a kind of list or overview of the things that we're going to briefly talk about today for extending the grazing season. So we have everything from management, species diversity, using different types of forages, stockpiling forage, and then grazing corn stalks or cover crops. So we're going to touch a little bit on each of these and talk about maybe how we might kind of work these different things together. And then at the end, I put together kind of an example based on a research project that we have had going on the last several years at one of our research stations that kind of uses a lot of these strategies. So we'll kind of tie it all together with that kind of real life example at the end. So first thing I mentioned was using good management, right? So, this is not a talk on pasture management, but I wanted to just touch on a couple things pertaining to pasture management because using good management in and of itself can actually help us extend the grazing season and be able to graze longer and produce more forage on the pastures that we do have. So, you may or may not be familiar with the continuous grazing. So, all the animals have access to the entire field compared to more of a rotational system where we've subdivided those fields and we're moving those animals through those different subdivisions or through those different sections. We know that there's a lot of benefits in rotational grazing in allowing our forages in other areas that are resting time to recover and regrow and replenish their energy reserves. But even beyond this, the more we're rotating and moving those animals around and the more we're kind of focusing them in on smaller areas, actually that's going to make our grazing throughout the entire field a little bit more even, and we're going to be able to use more of the forages that are there that the animals might otherwise have avoided or not grazed or not gone to those areas. So using rotational grazing, among other benefits, can increase our overall forage utilization of the whole field. And you can see, that utilization going up from, 30 to 40% up to more like, 60 or 70% by using some good rotational grazing management. So we're never going to get to 100%, but we can definitely increase use of the forages that are there just by using good grazing management with a rotational system. The other thing for management is that proper rest following grazing allows for those plants to recover quicker. So this is also accomplished by that same kind of rotational grazing system. But when those plants are able to recover quicker, they're actually able to grow more and produce more in the long run. And so this is just a visual example of that. On the left-hand side of that image, you can see this is an orchard grass plant, and it was meant to simulate a continuous grazing system. So it was clipped every week down to 1 inch to kind of showcase that kind of repeated grazing over and over that we typically see in a continuous grazing system. On the right-hand side is a plant that was meant to simulate a rotational system. So this plant was clipped once a month down to a 3.5 inch height to kind of simulate that once a month rotation or, that rotational grazing system. And after repeating this, several times, This next image is going to show you what the regrowth of those plants looked like. So this image is when those pots were cut, when both of those plants were cut, and this is the amount of regrowth that showed up just 6 days later. And so you can clearly see that the plant on the right had those energy reserves, it was rested, it was allowed to kind of have that regeneration period, and as a result, it was able to regrow a lot more forage a lot faster. So allowing that proper rest and using that rotation can really help us boost our total forage production in our existing fields. And then finally, the third point to kind of drive that home is it depends on a couple things. One is the length of rest period, but the other thing is also the residual or the height that those forages are grazed down to. So this study was looking at growth rate of plants based on different residual heights. So how tightly those forages were grazed or harvested. And you can see we're just going to look at, for example, a 2-inch residual, which might be something like this. So, you can see that plant is grazed down fairly tightly. There's not a huge amount of leaf material left versus more of a 4-inch residual, which might look something like this, where we can see it was grazed. The top of that plant has been eaten off, but it was not eaten quite as closely. There's a lot more leaf material remaining. And as a result, we can see that this plant on the top is going to have a really slow rate of photosynthesis. There's not a lot of leaf material, and plants need that green leaf material to photosynthesize and produce energy. And at the bottom, this one's of course going to have a much faster rate of photosynthesis because we've left more green leaves there. That green tissue is able to photosynthesize and produce energy for that plant. And as a result, when we look at the growth rate or how fast those plants are growing, you can see that the 4-inch residual had a much faster growth rate. So more like, in this example, 50 pounds per acre per day versus, maybe 35 pounds per acre per day. And what that means is that those plants are able to produce more in a shorter amount of time. So for this example, for this study, the plant that was cut to a 2-inch residual height took about 64 days to regrow 1 ton of forage versus the one cut at a 4-inch height only took 40 days to regrow up to 1 ton of forage. So leaving that extra residual, while it seems counterintuitive to leave a little bit more in the field, it actually increases the growth rate of that plant. And this can be a benefit in terms of total seasonal production or long-term productivity of that forage. So that was just my abbreviated version, I guess, of pasture management in a nutshell, just to showcase that, pasture management and how we're managing our existing grazing system can help us increase the productivity of our fields and help extend that grazing season. So that's the first step. If we haven't started there, that's always the best place to start. So moving on from there into some of the other strategies for extending the grazing season, we know that even with the best grazing management, our pasture production is not always consistent, right? A lot of us, I'm based here in Maryland in the Mid-Atlantic region, and anywhere kind of in this region or north of here, we rely predominantly on cool season grasses for the base of our perennial pasture forage. And these cool season grasses, of course, fluctuate in their growth throughout the season and with variable growing conditions. And what we see is, of course, a lot of growth in the spring and early summer. We typically go through that kind of summer slump in the middle of the summer where things slow down. And then we see additional growth in the fall when things are, again, cooler and these plants are thriving in that cooler weather. But our livestock requirements are pretty consistent, right? So they're going to require forage year round, regardless of the time of year that it is. So there are times of year when our forage production is not necessarily going to match our livestock needs or our livestock requirements. So what can we do to kind of help fill in those areas, fill in some of the gaps while kind of keeping this grazing system going? So the first thing is to add diversity by using legumes. So we have a lot of different options for perennial legume species, things like alfalfa, red clover, white clover, cure clover, birdsfoot trefoil. All of these are great legume forages that can be used to, can be incorporated into a pasture system. And the benefit of some of these legume species or having some of them there, well, there's a lot of benefits, but in terms of season extension or grazing extension, Oftentimes these legumes typically have a more of a tap root system compared to more of a fibrous root system that many of our grass species have. So sometimes this allows them to reach a little bit deeper or further for water and nutrients. Alfalfa especially is one in particular that can have a really, really deep, long root system. And this often makes them a little bit more resilient to heat and or drought. So usually our legume species have a little bit less of a summer slump compared to a lot of our cool season grasses. And you can see that in the figure at the bottom. If you look at the cool season grass line, which is in blue, compared to the forage legume line, which is the green line, you can see that they usually experience a little bit less of a summer slump, kind of helping to fill in that dip a little bit when some of our cool season grasses are really kind of not very productive. Along with legumes, we can incorporate other forages as well. So I wanted to touch a little bit on annual forages and kind of working these into a pasture system. So we have a lot of different options in terms of annual forages, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the different considerations that we might want to think about when we're debating using some of these different forages. But keep in mind that these are all annuals, so they have a 1-year life cycle, just like annual plants that you may plant, in your gardens or around your house in your flower beds. These are a 1-year life cycle, so they will need to be replanted on an annual basis if you're going to kind of continue to use them. So that can be a drawback, but on the plus side, they are very quick to establish and they're really fast growing and they can produce a lot of high quality forage in a short amount of time. So there's a lot of different situations where that could be really advantageous. So for these annual forages, we may be looking to extend the grazing season a little bit earlier or later in the spring and fall, and that would be largely with cool season annuals. So here you see some growth curves for a lot of our cool season perennial forages like orchard grass, tall fescue. You can see some of the cool season perennial legumes in there. Again, you can kind of see if you look at those legume growth curves, you can see how they're a little bit more spread out, a little bit more even growth throughout the year. And when we start to layer in some of the annuals, here would be examples of some cool season annuals like small grains, annual ryegrass. You can see those start to grow a little bit earlier in the spring. They can continue to grow a little bit later into the fall or early into the winter months. So we can kind of start to add a little bit of season extension on the ends. And we can also layer in some summer annuals or warm season annuals, things like sorghum Sudan grass or pearl millet that can start to add a little bit of growth during the heat of the summer, during that summer slump. Because these are warm seasons, they really thrive in that kind of hot, dry weather, and they can produce a lot of forage during those times of the year. So like I mentioned, these annual forages establish very quickly and can be used as a forage source for pasture or for harvested forage if you're harvesting them for either hay or silage or something like that. Cool season annuals, like their name suggests, would be utilized mostly in the spring and fall. So we can graze earlier in the spring or later into the fall months with these. And the nice thing about these annuals is the time from planting to grazing is really short and really quick, right? So it depends obviously on the weather conditions and the time of year that things are planted, but we can be going from planted to ready to graze in as little as 30 days, maybe 45 or 60 if we have conditions not quite perfect. Same thing for the warm season annuals. Again, these would be planted in the summer months, and they can have a really short time frame from going from planted to grazing. So we can use these a lot during that summer slump, and they can be a real lifesaver sometimes if we have drought conditions or things really slow down in the summer. We're not going to kind of go through this whole thing, but this is just a list showing a whole bunch of different annual forage options and then some yield measures and some different quality measures. And I just wanted to showcase this to show that annuals not only can produce a lot of forage, but they can produce a really high quality forage. So if we kind of look at some averages from this figure, we can see, protein levels 11 to 23%, fiber concentrations 30 to 60%, energy concentrations 45 to 70%. And of course, that is kind of big ranges, and it depends a lot on what forage is planted, the time of year, what maturity stage the sample was taken at. All of those different factors will affect that, but just to illustrate that annuals can produce a really high quality forage. So some of the major cool season annual options can be things like annual or Italian ryegrass, oats, some of our small grains like triticale, wheat, barley, rye, brassicas like turnips or rape. As far as legumes, cool season legume that are annuals could be things like crimson clover, vetch, winter peas. Again, there's a lot of different options. This is not a completely exhaustive list, but this is some of the more common options for cool season annuals. And if we look at the kind of yield of these, this is just one example. This was some work that we did when I was a master's student at the University of Minnesota, and we looked at different cool season annual options in a grazing system. These were actually grazed by horses, but could easily have been grazed with other species as well. And this is showing these cool season annuals planted in the fall. And what you see here is the bar heights represent the total yield, but each of the colors represent different grazings. So the yield at the first grazing, and then we let it regrow, and then the yield at the second grazing, and then for some of them the yield at a third grazing. So you can start to see a lot of differences in terms of yield from some of these different forage options. We have some that continue to really regrow, continue to produce a lot of yield across multiple different grazings. And examples of those like annual ryegrass, the winter barley, really kind of kept regrowing and producing a lot of forage. We had other ones, things like the spring barley or spring oat, that produced a lot of forage initially, but these don't really withstand repeated grazing quite as well. So one of the major considerations when we're deciding on these different forages is, do we want to be grazing this repeatedly, or are we looking for more of a kind of large one-time yield for either harvesting or one big grazing before we, establish something else or plant something else? So there can be, major differences in our selection depending on what our goal is. And I also just wanted to mention that, you can see yields here range from like 1.5 up to 3 tons per acre. We've done a lot of work with annuals here in Maryland, and you can actually get, more yield than that even. So we've had triticale plots that are up above 4 tons per acre. So you can really produce a lot of forage in that short amount of time. And this is just visually what that same study, just some pictures snapped from that study of what it would look like. So this was after 2 grazings. So this would be going into the 3rd grazing. And you can see here that kind of that spring oat and spring barley really had kind of petered out and weren't producing a lot of forage after several consecutive grazings, versus something like annual ryegrass was continuing to regrow and put on additional forage across multiple grazings. So again, have to think about your goals there. We also have considerations for overwintering potential. So some of the forages, the cool season forages that are established in the fall, have the ability to be used in the fall and then will overwinter and can also be used that following spring. And then there are other cool season annuals that will winter kill, so they won't survive over the winter. And you can see here from that same experiment, some of the different plots where some things did overwinter, other things did not overwinter. One of the biggest ones that usually will not overwinter is oats. So oats is a really good forage, produces a lot of forage, but it's not a winter hardy species, so it won't necessarily overwinter, versus something like a winter wheat, winter rye. Those will overwinter and will be there the following spring. Along with the overwintering potential, the timing also varies between these different species, both in the fall and also the following spring. So if we look here at the fall first, we can see that some species put on more forage than others in the fall. So oats, I mentioned, won't necessarily overwinter, but it does put on a lot of forage in the fall, assuming it's planted at the right time. Winter rye is fairly cold tolerant, so it can also put on a lot of growth even as the weather is starting to get colder, compared to, more of like the annual ryegrass might not put on as much forage during those fall months. And then for the species that overwinter, we also have differences going into that following spring. So I mentioned, winter rye being one of our more cold tolerant varieties. We'll usually see that one greening up and starting to grow earlier in the spring compared to something like a winter wheat, which will be a little bit later in the spring. So again, it all depends on your goals, when in the year you're going to be wanting to graze these forages, how long you're going to be wanting to graze these forages. That will really start to narrow down your species selection. As far as warm season annuals, we again have a lot of options, just like for our cool season annuals. These are, again, not an exhaustive list, but some of the major warm season annual species that we see used in grazing systems, things like Sudan grass, sorghum Sudan grass, some of the millets, teff, crabgrass, some of the legumes, cowpeas, forage soybeans, sun hemp, buckwheat. There's a lot of different things that we can use for grazing during those summer months. And we'll have some of the same considerations for our warm season annuals as we do for the cool season annuals. So this is another study from my time at the University of Minnesota looking at different options for warm season annuals under a grazing system. And the annual ryegrass, of course, is a cool season. That was just included as kind of a control. And then you can see some of the warm season annuals that we use: teff, Sudan grass, sorghum Sudan, and a couple millets. And again, we saw a lot of differences in terms of yield and in terms of regrowth. So this is the same kind of figure. The bars are adding up to be kind of the total yield, and the different colors are indicating different different bouts of grazing. So you can see something like Sudan grass kept growing a lot of forage for repeated grazings, kept kind of regrowing after multiple different grazings, and produced kind of a lot of yield over that total when you add all those different grazings up. Versus something like a Japanese millet or a Siberian millet really don't do well with kind of regrowing following a grazing. They're kind of more of a one and done type of forage where, we'll see one big harvest and then not see a lot of regrowth after that. One of the ones that was not included in this study is pearl millet, which actually of the millet varieties is the best for kind of repeated grazing bouts. So that one would be a little bit more similar to maybe the Sudan grass or sorghum Sudan grass. And again, big differences in the total yield. And you can see some of these summer annual forages can produce a huge amount of forage in that short amount of time. Another consideration for selection for both cool and warm season annuals, but in particular for warm season annuals, some of these forages tend to grow so quickly, and they get really, really tall, and they can get out ahead of you. And I'll explain a little, or I'll show a little video about the picture on the bottom left there, but that's some Sudan grass at one of the research stations where we were grazing some dairy heifers. And you can see that Sudan grass is up above the backs of those animals. So can produce a lot of forage and can get ahead of you really quickly if you're not on top of it. So the height of the forages varies across these different species. And if you're using some of our smaller animals like sheep or goats, you may not want to be planting something that can grow so tall unless you're going to really be on top of it, because when that gets that tall, those sheep and goats are not going to want to go inside of there to graze, and they're not going to use that forage as well as maybe some of our larger livestock species. There are, for some warm season annual species, dwarf varieties. So pearl millet is an example where they do have varieties of pearl millet that are dwarf varieties, so they grow a little bit shorter. So that can be an option as well. One other thing to consider with these annual forages is there is some potential for toxicity issues at different times of the year or under different growing conditions. We don't really have time to kind of get into that a lot, but just be aware that some of the species are susceptible to nitrate accumulation. I've listed some of the ones that are more prone to nitrate accumulation there. And then we also have prussic acid accumulation that can happen, in particular with our kind of sorghum Sudan grass species. All of these conditions can be managed to avoid issues. It's just something that you need to be aware of, and you need to be willing to kind of manage those accordingly to minimize your risk. So I know that's kind of a lot of information on different annual options and different things to consider. I really encourage you, if you're thinking about this at all or interested in annuals at all, to check it out for yourself. So either try it on a small area, or we have a lot of upcoming events on our Facebook page and our website. And we're doing a lot of different pasture walks at a lot of farms that are using annual forages, as well as trying lots of other things. And then these are a few photos from our research station here in Keedysville at the Western Maryland Research Center. And we have a study focused actually on using annuals to extend the grazing season. And as part of this study, we're looking at different mixtures, all the way from monoculture, one species, up to really complex mixtures. And we have several events that will be planned that either are coming up or will be coming up this year. So if you're interested in those, I did list the forage website page and our email listserv. If you're interested and you want to come check it out, look at the different annuals in person, talk about the different options, that's a good opportunity to do that. So switching from annual forages onto kind of another strategy, which is stockpiling forages. So for anyone who's not familiar, stockpiling forages is basically removing the animals to allow that forage to grow and accumulate and be able to graze it later. And so usually this happens in the fall. So normally around the August timeframe is when we would start stockpiling forages, and we would be looking to kind of let that forage accumulate and then graze that or utilize that forage in the either late fall or even into the winter months. And the benefit of that time of year and doing stockpiling at that time is the cooler temperatures allow us to accumulate a lot of high quality forage. So a lot of our cool season perennial grasses will only put out a seed head in the spring, and they'll, that's when we see forages getting a little bit more mature. And in the fall, we really see a lot of high quality vegetative growth that we can accumulate and then be able to graze that later on in the winter months. Tall fescue is actually one of the best forages for stockpiling. It maintains that quality really well going into the winter months. And because it has a little bit stiffer leaves, it kind of holds up a little bit better for winter grazing. So it can be a really, really good option for stockpiling forages. It works really well for that. This is just a photo of actually some cattle grazing on stockpiled annual forages. So you can also stockpile annual forages just as easily as perennial forages. And I wanted to show this picture because it's a good illustration of they're utilizing strip grazing. So essentially just moving that electric polywire back a little bit at a time, giving animals access to a little bit more forage either each day or several times during the day. And this really allows us to use all of that forage in that field and be able to make the most of that forage. You can see kind of back in the background behind those animals how clean that field is, how much of that forage they've really used. So if you want to really make the most of your stockpiled forage, using some sort of rotational grazing or strip grazing can be a really good way to kind of use a lot of that forage effectively. And this is just a picture of some stockpiled tall fescue. This was from down in North Carolina. You can see there the kind of what the fescue might look like in that kind of late fall time frame. Those animals are grazing that stockpiled forage, and you can see in the picture on the left in the front there where they had access to previously and what they've grazed, and then as they've moved into kind of the new section, what that growth looks like. So I mentioned that tall fescue in particular can maintain high quality going into the winter months. So just a little bit of data kind of showcasing that. This is showing different quality measures of tall fescue forage from October through March. So going through those winter months. And you can see that it maintains its quality really well, right? So crude protein in the red line has stayed fairly constant. Digestibility of that forage, which is the blue line towards the top, also remains relatively high over those winter months. So it is a really good option for kind of maintaining that forage quality. The other benefit of using tall fescue in the winter is this is typically when we see lower concentrations of ergovaline, which is one of the main compounds behind fescue toxicosis and potential problems with fescue toxicosis. And typically ergovaline concentrations are decreasing as we go into the winter and are kind of lowest during those winter months. So we see the least problems with fescue toxicosis if we have fescue that is the old, Kentucky 31 or the toxic tall fescue. We see the lowest concentrations of ergovaline then. So it can be actually a really good time to use that tall fescue. And then, we don't really see a huge amount of snowfalls like this, at least in Maryland, not since I've been in Maryland anyway, maybe up in the mountains, but just wanted to illustrate that we can be utilizing that stockpiled forage, underneath snow as well, assuming the cattle can, still reach down to get that forage. They are able to kind of root around in the snow and still utilize that stockpiled forage even through some snowfalls. All right, so the other one I wanted to touch on was grazing corn stalks and or cover crops. And this can be an option, so we can either use the corn stalks as a forage source. Corn stalks, of course, would be a little bit lower quality compared to our cover crops, but can still provide a good amount of roughage and a good amount of feed for those animals, typically cattle, but and we might have to supplement, a little bit of protein or minerals to those animals if they're grazing corn stalks. Or alternatively, if we have cover crops planted on that cropland, cover crops can be a really, really good source of forage. So cover crops are basically a lot of the annual forages that we talked about, right? And they can be a really good high quality source of forage during those winter months on our crop fields, and a really economical source of forage. So essentially, we're getting a cheap source of forage for our animals. Those animals are depositing manure on those fields, right? So a little bit of fertilizer for those crop fields, and some residue management, cleaning up some of the corn stalks or grazing some of the cover crops and utilizing those means we have a little bit less residue left in that field to use. And I think for Maryland and the Mid-Atlantic in particular, we use cover crops on a huge amount of acreage. You can see Maryland up there on the top compared to a lot of other states. This was back in 2017, so I would expect it would be even higher by now. But looking at the amount of cover crops that are used on harvested cropland. So I think there's a real potential to use a lot of those cover crop species as forages for our livestock, even on our crop fields. One of the biggest concerns people have with doing this is compaction on those crop fields. And so a few ways we can kind of reduce compaction risks associated with that are by, again, using our good grazing management, rotating those animals or using strip grazing, some way to kind of keep them moving across the field and not letting them kind of congregate and stay stagnant in a given spot. Leaving enough residue, so just like again with our good grazing management, leaving some residue to keep that soil surface covered and protected. It works best if we can do this on fields that have been planted with no-till. They typically have better soil structure because they haven't been tilled, so they're better at holding up to the impact of the animal's hooves and the animal's grazing. We should follow our best management practices for establishing our cover crops so that we get a good dense stand and we don't have like a really thin stand with a lot of exposed soil. We want to see a good, really dense, thick stand for grazing. We can avoid hopefully grazing this when the soils are really wet or really waterlogged or flooded. We want to avoid grazing at those times to kind of minimize our risk of compaction. And then along with moving the animals, if we can, moving our water or feeder or mineral sources around to different spots throughout the field or different access points, that can also help minimize potential risks with compaction. And they've done a lot of work looking at animals grazing on crop fields and the associated compaction, if there is any. And this is just one example of a study over several different years at a couple different locations. They were measuring basically compaction or the PSI, the pressure in those fields. And you can see the red line in each of those graphs is with no cover crops and no grazing. and the blue line is with cover crops that were grazed. And you can see that actually the compaction was similar or less in the fields that had cover crops and were grazed. So there's been a lot of work looking at this, and assuming that we're, following all of our best management practices for grazing, we can really not see a lot of issues with compaction for the most part. So kind of compiling all of that together, you can see how we can start to layer these different types of forages together and really start to build on that grazing season and extend that grazing season out. So again, these are a lot of our perennial cool season grasses and legumes. When we start to add in our stockpiled forages, we can, use those during the winter months. When we start to layer in those legumes, we can see a little bit more even distribution throughout that growing season. And then as we start to add in some of these cool season annuals and warm season annuals, we can really start to kind of get a more even distribution throughout that whole growing season. And it starts to look a little bit more like this, right? Where we're seeing much more even kind of growth of forage throughout the year, a lot of different forage options layered together that are able to be utilized over a really large majority of the year. So I said I wanted to kind of finish with an example of what this might look like in real life. And so this is a dairy heifer grazing study that we completed over the last 3 years at the Central Maryland Research Station in Clarksville. And one of the goals of this study, not the only goal, but one of them was to use annuals to extend the grazing season. And so, like I said, this is in Clarksville, Maryland. The pasture is a tall fescue base, so it's predominantly tall fescue. In the fields, we did frost seeding a little bit, clover and other things to kind of boost the productivity of those fields, but it was largely a tall fescue base. What we ended up doing was converting about 8 acres of this whole field, and I'll show you a map in a second, to annual forages. And in those sections, what we did was rotate between a winter annual and a summer annual and just kind of make that our annual forage field, and it was used for rotation. And I'll show you what the grazing schedule looked like. So here's a map of the field for this study. Everything you see in red was part of this rotational grazing group. And you can see there's a lot of different fields. Our annual forages were here kind of in the middle in field 5 and 6. And that is because you can't really tell from this map, but fields 2, 3, and 4 were all really hilly. So this was kind of 5 and 6 were kind of a flatter area at the top of the hill. And that's what we decided to use those annual forages in. So we were able to kind of get those established. Here's what an example of a grazing schedule looked like. So this are the actual dates that we grazed these different forages in 2022. So our winter annuals, we had planted the previous fall and grazed them a little bit the previous fall, our oat, ryegrass, and triticale. And you can see they were planted September of 2021. Like I mentioned, we did graze them a little bit that fall. But in the spring, we were able to start grazing around April 1st. And we grazed those actually for a couple months. That ryegrass really just keeps on trucking. So we grazed those pretty heavily during those spring months while our tall fescue was growing and, having some nice spring weather to really accumulate a lot of forage. Then we shifted them onto that tall fescue pasture. While we did that, in those annual fields, we were able to establish our warm season annuals. So we flipped from cool season to warm season annuals. And we started grazing those around July 10th. So they were planted in early June, started grazing around July 10th. So again, about that kind of 30 to 40 day time frame from planting to starting to graze. In this instance, we used Sudan grass and cowpeas, and those things just keep trucking through the summer months and really produce a lot of forage. So we were grazing on those from mid-July all the way through early September. So again, our perennial fields, our tall fescue fields really got that nice rest period to accumulate a lot of forage. Then we shifted them back to the perennial pasture, and we were using that during kind of the early fall months. And then our summer annual field was converted back to winter annuals. So these were planted in September when we moved the animals off, and we were grazing those starting around the middle of December. And you can see kind of an image of what those looked like going into the winter months. You'll notice that this is a really short time frame that we were using those. We actually had a lot of forage left as of December 19th, but this was the year that we had that really, really cold snap the week before Christmas, and we were relying on, we unfortunately don't have a frost-free water hydrant in those fields, so we had no way to provide water to them without everything being completely frozen, so we had to stop early. But we did have forage to continue, I would say, at least into January, using those cool season annuals if we were able to kind of keep grazing them. So you can see kind of how we started to layer some of these different things together throughout the year. We were able to stockpile that fescue while the animals were grazing on the warm season annuals and kind of rotate between these different fields accordingly. I mentioned that especially for the summer annuals, they can start to get ahead of you really quickly. You saw a screenshot of this picture. I wanted to show just this quick video to kind of illustrate that even though it did get ahead of us and it was really a lot of forage, those heifers were actually able to use that forage really well. So this is what the field looked like when we put the heifers in. Again, you can see a huge amount of forage growth there in that field. And in a second, it's going to pan to what it looked like after we moved the heifers out of that section into the next section. And you'll see that they really did utilize a lot of that forage. They basically stripped the leaves off of that Sudan grass. A lot of the stalks were trampled down into the soil, so that was kind of actually a benefit in terms of kind of covering that soil and working on building some soil health there by pushing that organic matter down into the soil. So I don't necessarily recommend letting it get ahead of you, but you know, it can be used or can be done. And this is, you know, in the subsequent years when we were more on top of things, this is more what it looked like as we were utilizing that Sudan grass. So the picture on the top left is, you know, you have to stay ahead of it. So we were onto it quickly, moving through it relatively fast. And then the picture on the bottom right is the last section that they grazed before we were, you know, circled back around to the beginning. So that's as tall as it got when we were actually on top of it and kind of managing it a little better. But still, you can see a lot of forage there. You can see they still used a lot of that forage, still trampled some of it down into cover the soil, same kind of thing. So just, you know, again, management is important, and these annuals really can produce a lot of forage in a short amount of time. So you really need to kind of be on top of things. I mentioned that these annuals can produce a lot of high quality forage in a short amount of time frame. So this is, we were taking forage samples as part of this study, and I wanted to just show basically the total mixed ration that our control group of heifers was receiving compared to some of these annual forages that our animals were grazing. And you can see if we look at the TMR column, the total mixed ration versus our Sudan grass cowpea mix and our triticale, you can see that those annual forages were able to basically meet or exceed the quality of the TMR that the control heifers were getting. So really high quality forage from those annuals, you know, good protein levels, a lot of energy, and the heifers did really well on it. So this is that same study kind of tracking their body weights throughout the growing season or their average daily gain between different weigh periods. So I wanted to layer in here when the grazing group was on the triticale, the fescue mix, the Sudan grass cowpeas, and then back to the fescue again. And the green line is showing our grazing group. So those were the ones rotating through those different mixes. The gray line is our control group, which were the ones getting TMR, and they did have access to just a fescue field. And you can see there's a lot of variability. So weather, different fluctuations in forage quality as forages were maturing. We did, as part of this study, have animals entering and leaving the group because we were using bred heifers. So as they were ready to calve, they would leave. So there's a lot of variability here. But if we look at, you know, some of the main time points when they were grazing those animals, we see that they did have really good average daily gains when they were utilizing those annual forages. So just wanted to illustrate, you know, that these can be used for, you know, young growing animals or animals that you're trying to put a lot of gain on, or high producing animals. So a few final kind of considerations. These annual forages do require more inputs and a little bit more management. So they, you know, do have seed costs. And like I said, they need to be established on an annual basis. So that takes time, that takes money for seed. That is actually one of the things we're trying to look at in our current study is is it worth the time and the money? Do you get, more than your return on investment back from using some of these annual forages? Again, remember to be aware of some of those issues with some of the species with nitrate or prussic acid accumulation. I know that there's a lot of options when it comes to annual forages, and it can start to get complicated quickly. So just remember, what are your goals? What are the times of year when you're usually the most limited on forage? What are the forage options that might be able to help fill in those gaps, and focus on those? And then, like with everything, start small. And if you're going to try this, try it on a small area first. Come to some other, pasture walks or events and familiarize yourself with some of these forages, and kind of help you decide where you want to start with that. So when we think about kind of season extension overall, we really want to focus on following good grazing management practices. We really want to promote diverse forages and use kind of that forage diversity to our advantage, whether that's legumes, whether that's annual forages, whether that's warm season forages. Keeping our goals in mind will help us decide what forages might work for us or what different strategies we can use. And like I said, starting simple and kind of staying flexible and playing around with different things, try something new, and going from there, finding what works for you. So that was everything that I had. I'm happy to take questions if there are any. I did also put my contact information up here. If anyone has questions later or wants to follow up, more than happy to kind of follow up with people as well. I do see a few questions in the chat. All right, I'm just gonna read these questions. I assume we should not allow animals to graze down grasses during the winter, take them off for most of the remaining winter months, and then put them back in the rotational grazing come spring. I'm not sure if you're referring to the annual forages or the perennial forages. If you're still on, maybe you want to clarify if you're which forages you're talking about for that one. While you do that, I'll look at the next one. Is that digestibility and quality for stockpiled fescues for all ruminants or mainly cattle? So the quality numbers that I showed are from the plants. So that's what the forage quality tested at. So you just have to match that forage quality with whatever species you have. So these stockpiled forages can be used by cattle. They can also be used by sheep or small ruminants as well, as long as you're making sure that kind of the quality that you have there matches the quality that the animals need. So you can kind of do a little matching game with the livestock requirements and the existing forage quality. But you can definitely use stockpiled forages and annual forages and all these different strategies for all different species of animals, cattle, sheep, goats, horses. It may just kind of, the ones that you pick may adjust based on what species you're going to use. And then can you talk about how the forage seed was planted and how smaller farms might be able to plant their forage mixes without large machinery? Yes, that is actually one of the most common challenges that goes with kind of annual forages and establishing things a lot. So for our studies, everything was planted using a no-till drill. So we unfortunately have access to no-till drills and are able to use that to establish them. There are a lot of no-till drills available for use or for rent at some of the soil conservation districts or other kind of agriculture agencies. I'm actually working on compiling a list of which counties and which soil conservation districts have equipment and like a link to their websites for people to kind of refer to, and hopefully going to get that up on our forage extension page in the relatively near future. But so that can be an option. You can rent or borrow or use a drill if you want to use a no-till drill. You can, if you're planning to do this long term, you can invest in your own or partner with someone, maybe a few farms that want to share a drill. You can also try doing some broadcasting. You're not going to probably get as good of establishment with broadcasting as you will with kind of drilling those forages in, unless you're going to maybe like till the field beforehand and kind of go through all those steps. But you can try to use broadcasting and then maybe broadcasting seed and then letting animals graze. That that area to kind of stomp that seed into the soil, or broadcasting that seed and then dragging some sort of, something to kind of disturb that soil a little bit. I've seen people put weights on a chain link fence and drag that around. I've seen people use like an arena drag, but flip it upside down so the spines are up and drag that around. Just something to kind of work that seed into the soil a little bit. So it will really depend on getting a little bit of seed to soil contact, how much soil disturbance you have, and then you want to select species that are better off with broadcasting. For example, some of the winter, some of the small grain species, a lot of those need to be planted a little bit deeper, so they typically don't work quite as well with broadcasting as they would with a no-till drill. So you might want to look at something like an annual ryegrass, or if it's in the summer, a crabgrass, some of those kind of lighter, fluffier seeds that are not meant to be planted as deep. So that will play into your, decision on what you're establishing as well. So hopefully that helps a little bit. I didn't see anyone follow up on the first question yet, but we frost seed. Oh yes, frost seeding is another option as well. So yep, that's perfect. Especially with a lot of our clovers, those can work really well for frost seeding. Yep, so hopefully that works out, and you'll have to keep us posted. All right, any other questions? Oh, perfect. White clover is a great one for frost seeding. We use that on a lot of those pastures in Clarksville for that heifer study. All that tall fescue pasture, we did frost seed red and white clover into that to try to help add some legumes and some diversity. All right, well, I'm not seeing any other questions, so I just want to say thanks again, everybody, for joining. This presentation was recorded, so it will be posted to the Women in Agriculture YouTube channel, and I'm going to share a copy of the slides with Shannon as well, so she can send out a follow-up email to anyone who registered with a copy of the slides and the link to the recording. And as always, feel free to follow up if you have questions or if anything else comes up. And thanks again.